Good day, everyone. This is Jim Ogsbury. I'm the Executive Director of the Western Governors Association, and I'd like to thank everyone who's participating in this virtual workshop of Reimagining the Rural West, the WGA Chair Initiative of North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum. To note that this workshop is proceeding under extraordinary circumstances is to state the obvious. We're all facing challenges the likes of which none of us have ever confronted in our lifetime. For those of you who had planned to join us in the Dalles for this workshop, please understand that we share your disappointment that we're not all together under one Oregon roof today, and we appreciate your understanding that we had no choice but to cancel the in-person meeting that we had scheduled for the next 2 days. The New York Times published a story yesterday headlined, "Once Political B-Listers, Governors Lead Nation's Coronavirus Response." Though I would vigorously dispute the notion that our governors have ever been political B-listers, there is no doubt at all that they are the ones who are at the very front lines of battling the coronavirus. They are making difficult decisions daily about testing protocols and priorities, housing, treatment, quarantine, and care of COVID patients, limitations on gatherings and suspension of commercial activities and closures of restaurants and theaters and other enterprises in an effort to limit the spread of the virus, all the while taking action to keep critical supply chains functioning and healthcare operating and food supplies available. It's because of this focus on the crisis at hand that Governor Brown is unable to join us today. She's expending all of her energy battling the present public health threat. She does, however, extend her warm regards and her appreciation for your participation. Now, I mentioned that we had no choice but to cancel the in-person workshop. We did, however, face a choice as to whether to cancel the workshop altogether or convert it to a virtual gathering. Given the very fluid and uncertain environment, that was not an easy decision. We decided to proceed, however, because even though the challenges of the rural West may be temporarily eclipsed by a global pandemic, they're not going away, and they're certainly not going away without the concerted effort of governors, experts, and those with a stake in maintaining the viability and promoting the prosperity of rural communities. The extraordinary registration numbers for the workshops today and tomorrow have validated that decision, and I am so proud to be associated with this group today, a group that's willing to power on despite challenging circumstances to tackle social and economic problems in the rural West that will endure long after the coronavirus outbreak curve is flattened. So thank you very much. This initiative is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors and partners. I'm especially pleased to recognize WGA's federal partners in this effort, the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the State Exchange on Employment and Disability of the U.S. Department of Labor. We are deeply grateful to USDA and SEED for their partnership as well as their generous financial support. I'm also pleased to recognize and thank our exclusive initiative sponsors, Western Governors University and Grow with Google. Our signature workshop sponsors are Share Our Strength and the U.S. Travel Association. Thanks also to America's SBDC and Ann Walker Consulting for their partnership and support. This is our final workshop in a series that included sessions in Fargo, Santa Fe, and Post Falls, Idaho. This week's sessions and future webinars will continue to examine rural opportunities and challenges in economic development, infrastructure, and quality of life. The immediate product of these sessions will be a report for Western Governors containing findings and recommendations that will be published in connection with the WGA annual meeting scheduled for late June in Medora, North Dakota. Publication of that report, however, will not represent the end of the effort. Rather, it will mark the end of the beginning, because the results of this initiative will inform gubernatorial policy and WGA's work on rural issues for years to come. So once again, thank you for your interest and your participation and for providing the intellectual feedstock on which the governors will rely to make a positive difference in the lives of rural Westerners. And with that, I'm pleased to recognize Lauren Nino, who is helping to manage this initiative on behalf of Western Governors.
Thank you, Jim. We're so delighted to have you all here today, and we thank you for your flexibility as we adapt to our circumstances. As we are trying this virtual workshop format out for the first time, so please bear with us if there are any technical hiccups. I would encourage you all to take breaks when we're transitioning between panels. We've built in about 10 minutes there so people can stretch their legs and move around. You can also leave the webinar and then rejoin at any time. And the agenda is on our website, so you can keep track of when the panels you're interested in are coming up. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Kevin Moss to talk a little bit about the technical aspects of our software.
Great, thanks, Lauren. So through our upcoming keynote and also the panels that we have scheduled later today and tomorrow, we're going to be soliciting questions from the audience to incorporate into the discussion. So if you all look at the webinar platform on the left side of your screen, there is a chat box function. And so if you go and click on Attendee Chat, you can direct questions to the presenters. So if at any point you have a question or an aspect that you'd like to follow up on or seek more information on something, please feel free to use the chat box to submit a question. And then I'll be passing those over to Lauren today for her to incorporate into the discussion. And then as Lauren mentioned, between each session, we're going to be taking a 10-minute break, and that's for us to essentially bring up the next round of panelists and check their mics and that sort of thing. So just to reiterate, please bear with us as we handle any technical connectivity issues. And once again, we really appreciate you participating.
All right, well, without any further ado, I would love to introduce our keynote speaker who we're thrilled to have today. Ben Alexander is joining us from Bozeman, Montana, where he is a senior program advisor at Resources Legacy Fund. He's responsible for providing coordination, research, and strategic direction for Resources Legacy Fund programs. He previously served as Chief Program Officer at the Lohr Foundation and was co-founder and co-director of Headwaters Economics and was a director at the Sonoran Institute. He has worked for 25 years in the West on a range of land use and development issues, and he's going to be sharing some of his recent research on economic transitions in the rural West. All right, take it away, Ben.
Thank you, Lauren, and thanks, Jim, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. I assume most people are either at the noon hour on the West Coast or in the Intermountain time zone, so welcome. I, too, am disappointed that we're not visiting in person. Much harder to see the audience and audience reactions and engage around discussion of the topics virtually, but I really appreciate that we still have a chance to share some ideas and talk virtually today. Well, as Jim said, these are difficult times, in some ways for us unprecedented times, and one of the strengths of rural America and the rural West is an ability to pull together in times of duress. And I want to talk to you a little bit about some rural efforts today in the Intermountain region primarily that focus on efforts to transition economies from a narrow historical focus on a smaller set of industries to a, we hope, more diversified, resilient mix of industries as we look forward. Today, I'm going to share some research that I spent the last year working on that looks specifically at economic transition efforts in communities that have economies that are narrowly focused on the production of oil and gas and coal, but the findings broadly apply to rural economies, whether they're more focused on farming, forestry, mining, retirement, or tourism, quite frankly, because they're all facing the same underlying set of trends and conditions and responding to them in ways that challenge us to think about what successful economies look like today and going forward. So I'm going to summarize that research. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about sort of the nature of economic change, but I'm not going to focus on that overly because as Lauren and Jim and others and I have talked about the real benefit from, we hope, this presentation, that's focusing on solution concepts and things that are working. And certainly today, with all the challenges we face, let's all agree to focus on things that are working or things that can work. So I do need to set the stage a little bit, and I've only got a few slides for you all today, but so that you don't just have to listen to me, giving you a little bit of eye candy here. I don't want to describe how radically the economy of the West and the rural West has changed over the last couple of generations, but I just want to set the stage for what we're dealing with here briefly, and that is to say that we have obviously an economy that's fully globalized and challenged in that globalization at the moment. It is characterized by free trade agreements and some continuing protections. It has been fundamentally altered in our lifetimes by automation. And that some of the industries that have been mainstays for our rural communities, particularly in the commodity sectors, are now at a stage of development where they are called by economists as mature, which is to say they're not generating a lot of new employment, and they're attracting investment largely for technology investments that increase productivity. The results of those trends and realities is that we need fewer and fewer people to produce more and more output. It also means that we face fierce competition from abroad and that we face razor-thin profit margins within many of our commodity sectors. The other stage I want to set is that the U.S. economy overall, and by this I mean primarily the urban components of our economy, both within the region and across the country, have moved from historically a reliance on some of our goods producing and commodity sectors to a more balanced mix of industries that is characterized largely today, and especially in the high growth sectors, in what economists and others call services, which are a mix of high and low paying industries and occupations that are associated with those. You can see the 20 North American Industrial Classification System categories at the 2-digit level on the right-hand side on the graphic we're looking at. And you can also see where the predominant growth has been happening within the Western economy. Now, this is primarily an urban view because the urban economy is so much larger than the rural economy. Nonetheless, though, just for the purposes of setting the stage here, in addition to some of the changes we've seen in our traditional sectors, we're seeing high growth rates in a mix of services, some of those high-paying, high-skill, some of those low-paying, low-skill. And as we know, many rural places are struggling to attract those higher-paying, high-skill jobs as we see declines in many cases in some of our traditional sectors, and trying to avoid only attracting or creating some of those lower-paying and lower-skill sectors. So these trends have led to some unfortunate realities in some of our rural communities and landscapes. Not all bad, but I want to focus on a few that were challenged by, obviously, rural outmigration, aging in place, for many a declining standard of living, a sense that what we have done historically is no longer valued in the way that it once was. And for many, fear and a lack of clarity around what the new economic activities, occupations, and industries are that can sustain our communities going forward. So that's the sort of, the doom and gloom version. I also want to say that local conditions vary dramatically. And speaking in these broad brush terms, I don't mean to suggest that all communities are characterized by these challenges in similar ways, or that they haven't found ways to adapt to some of these changes successfully. No two places are exactly alike. Today's not the time, but at some point, maybe another day, we can set time aside to talk about useful economic typologies for the rural West, and using those ways of thinking typologically, think about different kinds of strengths and weaknesses in today's economy that communities can avail themselves of. Whoops, I'm trying to go to the next slide here unsuccessfully, Lauren. There we go. So over the last year, I spent a lot of time doing some academic style research and then doing some in-community case study work, talking to the people on the ground who were doing economic development and those who were working with them at the state level and regionally. And I was fortunate enough to get academic advisors from New Mexico State University, the University of Wyoming, and Montana State University to look at this question of whether and how energy-focused economies in the Intermountain West have been able to transition their economies from a narrow focus on fossil fuel production to a broader mix of industries, as I've mentioned. I think this question applies, as I've said, to a broader set of types of communities and types of economies in the rural context, but I just want to be clear that the fundamental research I looked at was at energy-focused places. And I'm showing you a screen capture here of a online interactive, which I can provide access to anyone who's interested in this after the webinar. But we went through an exercise of trying to figure out, well, what is an energy-focused community? Where are they located? How long have they had this dependency or competitive strength, depending on how you think about it? And how have their economies evolved more recently as a way of thinking about which of those communities and economies are diversifying in today or over the last 10 years or so? So this is just a screen capture, and for the purposes of this research, we used a definition. The published data goes back to 1970, so we took that. At the time of the research, we took about a 37-year time span, and we said you had to be 20, or I think it's 18 or 20 years or more, have above average earnings as compared to the region in oil and gas and coal production. And if you did, we labeled you energy focused. Then we began to look at the overlap between the oil and gas and the coal, the distribution across states, and we began to think about we began to think about whether diversification was happening, where it was happening, and then through a case study format to begin to talk about why it's happening and what can we understand about successful efforts to diversify economies. So we ended up with 3 case studies, and we selected those case studies for a variety of reasons in consultation with the academic advisors. We ended up looking at Delta County, Colorado, and Juan County, New Mexico. And we did a comparison, sort of compare and contrast case study in Wyoming between Campbell and Sheridan counties in Wyoming. Because even though those 2 counties and the communities of Gillette and Sheridan fit very proximate to the same fossil fuel resources, they're quite different places, and they've taken advantage of that access and opportunity to extract that resource in different ways. And so we can learn from that contrast. So those were our 3 case studies. And as you can see, partly because I think I was working with academics, we spent a little bit of time thinking about location quotients, which is a measure of industry concentration, and looking at whether over time some of these communities are decreasing or increasing their concentrations on fossil fuel production. In the end, we migrated to this industry diversification concept, just broadly speaking, contrasting services sectors with non-services sectors. And the non-services sectors, quite simply, are just everything that isn't a service, so they're goods producing and construction, typically. And that gave us a way, just initially, to understand, are services growing independently of non-services? Just a crude proxy for trying to think about whether diversification might be happening, before we started to look at it in more detail at the local level. So here's the bad news. There is not as much industry diversification going on at the local and rural level as, at least personally, I would like to see, because the hypothesis of the study is that diversification of the industry mix allows economies to be more adaptive and resilient over time. And that's not going to be true in all cases, but in general, where we have smaller economies in place that have a narrower focus of activity and industry, they can be very volatile. And one way to hedge against that, of course, is to broaden the mix of activities, and diversification is a great measure of that. There are a variety of ways to measure diversification. We're using a very simple one today, which is just contrasting the ratio of services to non-services and seeing whether those 2 sort of ways of thinking about the broad economy are trending similarly or distinctly. So a couple of things I want to just say before we dive into some of the learnings here from the research, and that is that this notion of economic development, I realize that it's a term that everyone holds in their minds in quite a different way. So in this work, we defined it as both an outcome and a process. And the outcome definition we used is that it's the creation of jobs and wealth and the improvement of quality of life. So it gives us that quantitative and qualitative measure. As a process, we looked at economic development as a process that influences growth and restructuring of an economy to enhance the economic well-being of a community. And it was very useful for us to think about it both as an outcome and as a process for thinking about, well, what is successful economic development and how do we go about understanding how it works and then replicating it once we understand some secrets to success. Because in the West and in rural places, economic development is so closely tied with culture and identity, and because so much of the transition challenge in literature focuses on crisis, ruptures, volatility of economic behavior, that I spent a fair bit of time looking at this notion of community resilience in addition to thinking about economic development. And the notion of resilience focuses on this idea of being able to absorb impacts and reorganize, and in an economic context, reorganize with a new understanding of competitive positioning. The key thing here is that this is not trying to keep a community or a place or an economy the way it is in the face of change, or even at a more elevated level, trying to control change. It's trying to shift attention and resources to cope with and adapt to change. And that notion of resilience, which is really adaptive capacity and willingness, is a key ingredient in the research and what we asked people about and what we found as an element of success. Lastly, this notion of diversification is kind of the hypothesis. The hypothesis is that diversification leads to greater resilience, or is a measure of that. And the definition that we use is the shift from a single source to multiple sources of jobs and income covering a large segments of the population. So those are the basic working definitions: the definition of energy focused, then economic development, resilience, and diversification. The three case studies are chosen intentionally to give us a mix of oil and gas and coal to represent three different states with unique policy environments and resources to support economic development. And they give us a nice mix of population size and degree of isolation from larger markets and major metropolitan centers. But with one thing they all have in common, which is that they have made intentional efforts to diversify their economies. And in some cases, you'll see, I'll argue in one of my case studies that we're looking at sort of a successful diversification by default, and I'll explain more about that later. But the key thing is that each of these case study communities and landscapes, there's an effort specifically designed to diversify and build more resilient economies in reaction to some sort of volatility or rupture. Lauren, I'm going to ask you to advance the slide if you would.
Sure, just let us know and we'll do it for you.
I appreciate that. So initially we thought that, in talking with the academics and folks on the ground working on economic development, that there might be one economic development approach that would emerge as a winner, or might be some limited combination of standard approaches that would be a winner. And I'm looking at the list of folks on this call. I recognize a number of you, many I don't know, but this is a sophisticated group of people. Many of you, I'm gathering, work in economic development, and you're aware that there are a variety of tools and approaches at our disposal. And we deploy those in different settings and in response to different types of challenges and opportunities. But the thing that we didn't see was a common thread that allowed us to say there's a single approach to economic development that makes sense for rural communities struggling with economic transitions. So we took a step back and said, well, okay, so if it isn't economic gardening, and it's not recruitment, it's not necessarily entrepreneurship or retraining, it's not by itself infrastructure or identifying promising industry clusters, are there other ways to think about guiding concepts here? So we thought about, the emphasis on impact assistance or reducing vulnerabilities, this notion of creating economic stability, which many people like the idea of, a focus on growth as such, or emphasizing emerging sectors as a key to success. And again, we felt like when we started to look at the broader patterns and at the success on the ground, that we didn't have an explanatory mechanism that felt particularly robust. And that led us to reconsider a couple of things. Lauren, would you advance the slide? And as I said, this notion of change is really crucial in rural settings. I think there's this naive urban concept that rural places are changeless. And maybe folks like us, many of whom live in rural areas, we like this idea that rural is changeless. We all know that's not true. But how rural responds to change, it turns out, is critical. And I think it's important because the economies of rural places until recently have not been stable. They've been evolving, but they've been so closely identified with a certain culture, skills, and identities that change has been difficult in recent years, whether that's demographic, new occupations and activities, new industries. Sometimes I find, and we find, that rural places fight change. The response is to try to keep places the way they are rather than to benefit from the trends that are around us and driving change within our very communities. So one of the key explanatory sort of questions that emerged was, what is the response to change in a place? What does productive response to change look like? And what does unproductive response look like? And so I found myself in the end started thinking about Janus, the Roman god of doorways, and this notion of simultaneously respecting the past and yet facing forward at the same time and trying and testing new things. So this notion of resilience is very tied to the notion of rupture, the character of response to that rupture, and whether it's adaptive or not. And this idea of honoring the past while facing forward became a kind of metaphor for me of what successful change really requires as we encounter the challenges and capitalize on the opportunities. The second piece here, do we have a strategy? When I started reading all of these economic development plans, I've written them, read them, critiqued them, maybe worked with some of you on them. One of the things that I feel like gets glossed again and again is an actual economic strategy. There are plans that focus on activities, that outline needs, that talk about impact assistance, that jump right to a set of things like reskilling and infrastructure, without asking the fundamental question of what is the competitive positioning of a place or a business in a place in the market today. The reason I think this is so important is that we have limited resources, leadership capacity, partnerships, and capital to work with. We have to be disciplined and efficient about how we think about reallocating and reinventing in today's world. And I think it's also critical because historically we have captured a comparative advantage in rural America. That is to say, we have captured a cost advantage. We have been an advantageous low-cost producer of one or more commodities over time, and that has worked very well for us. But today, increasingly, we're being asked to think in microeconomic terms, not just about providing supply on a low-cost basis of a good or product, but how to provide a more complex good or product specifically to a buyer that might be discerning, yet have a willingness to pay. That shift from capturing value to creating value, from macroeconomic to microeconomic, if you will, strikes me as a fundamental shift that asks us to rethink strategy. And here I borrow from the folks who wrote Playing to Win, which really just builds from Michael Porter's work on avoiding the comparative advantage trap and thinking about what competitive advantage is. And that's having the discipline to think first about what they call where to play before you focus on how to win. Where to play is really the fundamental idea of what's the right industry and industry segment to compete in. How to win is really the strategy of whether you can be a low-cost producer or need to pursue a differentiation strategy where you're not competing on cost, but rather you're competing on quality for an identified demand and market. So resilience and strategy struck me as concepts that came into clear focus as we visited communities and started to think about what works. So the essence of strategy is choice, and choice is a function of leadership. Not only executive function, but the ability to then sell, communicate clearly around, and lend credibility to the idea and value of choices that are different in the past. So we started thinking about leadership. And if, Lauren, if you'd advance the slide. At some point, I said, we need a change framework. And I'm going to run through sort of what we ended up with at the end of the day, and then I'm going to highlight some examples from the case studies talking about how this works. But I was really wrestling with sort of how do you describe how successful change could unfold around economic transitions. And as I was listening and reading and talking to people and going through some of the thought processes I've just outlined today, I realized that real change doesn't happen without some discontinuity. And they're really different kinds of, I'm going to call them rupture. Some are really violent, quick, and significant. They have the advantage of bringing focus. They have the disadvantage of allowing us a very short lead time to respond and to build our resilience and adaptive capacities. On the other end of the spectrum, we have that kind of slow change that's almost invisible. It's so invisible sometimes we don't even talk about it, except maybe at high school reunions when we reflect back at how fundamentally a town or community or school has changed as we've looked back on it. And yet that kind of change is in some ways easier to work with because it's not so rapid, and yet it's harder to work with because it's less tangible and harder to wrap our minds around and to build political will around. So one end of the spectrum or the other, we might find ourselves at the community level thinking about what our transition challenge and opportunities are. The key response variable in my mind is leadership, and whether individuals in a community who are respected and willing through their networks to discuss and explore new development pathways are present. And there's a lot of places that are fighting to go back to the future. There's a lot of places that want to stay the way they are. And there's the rarer, I think, rural community that's thinking about, well, what's next? What can I do to anticipate the changes that will mean that my current business mix will no longer be as prosperous and successful today as it will be in 10, 20, 30 years? What do I need to be doing differently now? Rupture helps leadership focus on that set of questions. When leadership can be less reactionary, more open, convening, and think the big ideas before narrowing down on a set of executable actions, I see more success happening. Now, that leadership has to then develop a vision for the future. Call it a vision of success that points ahead. Now, ideally, that exercise of drafting that vision is something the community as a whole works with, or certainly diverse interests within a community are part of crafting. And the very exercise of crafting that new vision can energize a community, and it should express a desired future condition that people feel good about, and outline with some degree of specificity how the community can get there. That's still not a strategy. So the next step, and I guess I just had to call it out because I felt like it's the step we leap over. It's really where we acknowledge our culture, assets, and market opportunities, and we go through the exercise of figuring out where to play and how to win. And that's a disciplined process that has been outlined in more detail than I can do today, but it really focuses on which industry and industry segments we can realistically compete in, and then whether we're going to pursue a low cost or a differentiation strategy. We then start to think about what are our human and financial resources to execute that strategy. Some of these focus on initial change, such as convening, planning, and the strategy development itself. Some focus on building new competitive advantage, things like training, new infrastructure, branding, and marketing. Some might focus on sustaining momentum over time, investor and customer relations, scaling startups, and even supporting new ventures. And over time, it seems to me that these resources need to rely less on outside support and more on local investment itself in order to be sustainable. This next piece is about execution. If we have leadership, vision, strategy, and resources, we set the stage for effective action. But this is not an easy thing. It involves coordination, adhering to choice commitments, a dedication to seeing efforts through to completion, And because economic development is a long-run game, it's longer than the news cycle, certainly even in the political cycle, it's a marathon even. We have to focus on initial steps that can build momentum and that can support longer-term efforts that require more significant investment and patience. So that disciplined execution is very closely tied with this notion of momentum and how we can sustain the effort and the focus on the effort. So let me jump to the next slide. Or if Lauren will. We looked at 3 places. I've mentioned Delta County, Colorado. This is a place that in 2013 had a longwall underground coal fire that destroyed the mine and was not reinvested in. 2 years later, 3 years later, another mine for different but related to reinvestment decisions in a not promising coal market resulted in the second round of large coal closures in the communities in the North Fork Valley, leading to an over 75% reduction in coal-related employment in a 3-4 year period, devastating that valley, leading to not a recession, but a full-blown depression, a contraction in the size of the overall economy. And a lot of soul searching about what next. Many people left, many people stayed. The piece I want to highlight for you all today on the call around what led and allowed Delta County to successfully move that red line on the right here in a different direction than the brown line below it on the graphic is, and it continues today, we see quantitative evidence of diversification, and we're now seeing strong signs of economic growth in Delta County, Colorado. That said, it's not a single industry that's replacing a single industry. And I think it's unrealistic in almost any setting today to think that large employers that once were the mainstays of many places that we grew up with and love will continue to be the mainstay industry, or if it declines or goes away, will be replaced by a single industry. That's one of the clear lessons. And that is really, that's a tough message. And that's a learning curve for a lot of places. So the Delta County story that's just so incredibly encouraging was it's a leadership tale of people at the Economic Development Authority and the local utility, which is a co-op-based model, Delta Montrose Electric Association, got together and with the help from U.S. Department of Commerce, EDA, the governor's office, DOLA, the Department of Local Affairs in Colorado, got some impact assistance resources, planning resources, and eventually project resources that allowed them to convene discussions, map out a plan and a strategy, and to begin to execute it. One of the most exciting pieces of that execution, or really of the vision and execution, is an initiative called Elevate that originated with Delta Montrose Electric Association. And it was the idea of delivering fiber and gigabit broadband to every household and business in the region. This is a fairly remote part of Colorado. It's a small population area. The total county has got less than 30,000 people. And it had some telecommuters and some people who had, found their way to the county from the Front Range and more populous areas. But it didn't necessarily think of itself as a place that needed fiber optics to succeed economically. But they went through a planning process where they identified that as a possibility. The electric co-op identified that they could do more and play a leadership role on basic infrastructure that extended beyond the delivery of power. And they realized that this, in the end, was going to be a foundational piece of competitive advantage for startups, businesses, and going forward for location-neutral businesses working remotely, including telemedicine and more. And so they went for it. Even though this was a massive infrastructure investment process, and when they looked at the original price tag, they thought, how are we going to do that? Leadership, clear vision, effective strategy brought the outside investment, and they're building out that infrastructure today, and it's already allowing for business relocation, scaling, and it's also had the important advantage of allowing the community to retain and rehire displaced miners who are installing the network and doing other aspects related to the reconfiguration of the grid. There's a lot of other stories there. I'm going to jump to the next one in San Juan County, which you may all associate with Farmington. This is a slightly bigger place, as many of you may know. It has a county population of 127,000 or so, and in the last decade, Farmington actually is a small metropolitan area now. And yet it's relatively isolated. Believe it or not, it doesn't even have a functioning commercial airport by any modern standard. And even though it has a population base of a metro area, it's relatively isolated in northwest New Mexico. Most folks will drive to Albuquerque or up to Durango for air service. It did not have strong telecommunications infrastructure. It was a long drive from those other areas. When they've had a series of setbacks economically that hit both their oil and gas markets from related to pricing, and then coal related to the phasing out of coal as a source of energy, which affected both their coal mines and their coal-fired power plants. There are details in the report about the nature of that decline and how quickly it's come and is still coming. What I wanted to impress on all of you today was the importance of the convening role early in that process and outside resources that enabled entities that historically had functioned in a fragmented, particular manner to coordinate. And they created something called FORCED, Four Counties Economic Development, which I think really for the first time, even though they'd had some regional economic development authorities, really allowed diverse entities, including the tribes. The Navajo tribe is half the land base in San Juan County, a significant portion of the population dramatically affected by the shutdowns in the coal mines and coal-fired power plants in particular. And it created a safe place for tribes, counties, city, state, and business interests to talk about the needs, to commission strategy and planning documents, and to begin to coordinate a joint understanding of what exactly was happening and what their opportunities look like. And they had several excellent strategies on the books, which do a number of things well. Each of these case studies is kind of graded as you go by yours truly as you go around my change framework about how they performed at each level. And the coordination gets a high grade, a little less so on the leadership. One actual tactic I want to call out is really successful here is a vocational training and certification program at San Juan Community College, which is just outstanding. Turns out that community colleges are crucial resources, assets, physical space for people to convene around a whole range of transition efforts. They become, in effect, hubs for retraining, for maker spaces, for incubators, for startup spaces, and in particular training naturally. So there's been a lot of existing retraining around vocational skills in the oil and gas and coal fields. Those have been rethought around IT and medicine, thought about the renewable energy economy as well. And here's a key thing. Many employees feel like they do not have the luxury of stepping out of high-paying resource sector jobs to get retrained for jobs that are lower paying and still sustain their debt load and their standard of living. And so they typically don't retrain, or they leave and follow the energy frontier in the case of the energy-focused communities. And this community, the San Juan Community Program, focused on this notion of stackable credentials so that it did market analysis about where the jobs are. So it didn't just train people for jobs that don't exist. And then it gave people an opportunity to step into and out of the labor market, to build skills in a sequential manner without foregoing income for a sustained period of time. And the sequential reskilling over time allows people to rebuild their earnings power. Now, that's going to be easier in farming and forestry contexts than it is in an energy context where the wage gap between energy jobs and all other jobs is so great. That has been a tremendous barrier for these communities moving forward. but it is a really practical and successful strategy for thinking about retraining and reskilling for new sectors in the market. I wanted to highlight that as really a bright spot. Lastly, in Wyoming, and I think I'm probably running out of time, so I'm going to just wrap this one up, but we did this wonderful comparative case study looking at Gillette and Sheridan in Campbell and Sheridan counties. And, you know, it's funny, and I'll talk about Gillette first because, you know, it's a place that was kind of mythic if you grew up in Montana in the 80s and, you know, with the oil and gas booms and later the coal-bed methane booms. And, you know, I've watched my friends out of high school, you know, head over to the Powder River Basin and come back driving brand new pickup trucks, wondering what that was all about. And today, it's a very different place that no longer has confidence that its future lies in coal mining or oil and gas production alone. And in fact, it's feeling tremendously vulnerable. The sense of vulnerability in Gillette and Campbell County has given them incredible focus on the need to explore alternative economic activities and industries. They have done a better job than anybody I met at being sober and clear about the need to think forward. The challenge they face is that they're not in a great place to recruit and relocate. They're there because of their access to carbon underground and the ability to pull it out efficiently and cheaply. And they know they're going to have a hard time pivoting to other sectors and recruiting people or incubating businesses that can compete in a more diversified context. They've developed a strategy which Phil and I, who's the local economic development guy at Energy Capital Economic Development, kind of jokingly call Carbon Plus. They have developed a high-risk, high-reward strategy around how they can reinvent around the use of carbon in new ways in today's market for things like manufacture, filtration, and sequestration. And they have been very successful at bringing in outside investment, technical support, and building partnerships with support from the state and U.S. Department of Commerce's EDA, figure out how they can develop proofs of concept and marketable concepts that are practical at today's price points. So they have a strategy, and they know it's a high-risk strategy, but they've done the hard work of trying to figure out what it is they can do in today's market, and they're going for it. That focus and the focus of the utilization of the resources at their disposal has just been, it's incredible. In Sheridan, Wyoming, interestingly enough, a very different tale. They've had a little more of the white collar or the gray collar, as they joke. They had more small foundation philanthropy in that community and county than I think almost any community, rural community in the Intermountain West. And yet, that sort of, and they're within what I would call the beauty strip with their proximity to the mountains and rivers that people love to fish, hike, hunt in, and all the rest of it. And yet those assets and opportunities have diminished their focus and I think made their leadership less effective. And at one point, coming out of the coal bed methane boom in the early 2000s, there was a realization that their infrastructure was falling apart. They had no vision for the future. They were barely, unfortunately, handling garbage services, street maintenance. They had no plans for future development outside of incorporated areas. According to a number of the local folks at the time, they were really kind of a mess, even though they had all these assets. And a fellow ran for mayor and won successfully and started to bring a disciplined focus to operations and planning and a new vision. When I talked to people 15 years later, they kept referring to this individual and they kept referring to what he accomplished as setting the table for the success we see today. I was just waiting for it after a while, setting the table. This individual had set the table. He had created a sense for the infrastructure, the planning process, the teams that needed to be working in concert for this community to succeed. They've eventually succeeded across a range of fronts. They still don't have the focus of a Gillette. They don't have the urgency of a Gillette, but they have enough assets, quality both in people and the built environment and the natural environment, that they are able to both lure entrepreneurs and scale businesses and attract talented employees and workers with skills in ways that a lot of places can't in today's market. But none of that would have taken place if they hadn't gotten their business acumen in order and begun to write their fiscal house, their planning house, and their infrastructure and relationships with the state to be able to spend money effectively. So I think that's the time I have, Lauren. I just to reiterate a point here, which is that, and we're facing a crisis in health today. Rural places have been facing a crisis for, I would argue, a couple of decades. And sometimes we see that as the slow burn, and sometimes we see that as the catastrophic large mill closure. And I don't know if it's easier for us to deal with the slow burn or the more volatile short-term rapid rupture. But here's what I do know. Responding to that change is hard work. It's slow work. It's slower than the news cycle or the political cycle. It requires patience and discipline. And for that reason, it's really important to think about staging, thinking about short, medium, and long-term activities and outcomes, and giving people and businesses something to touch and feel around success. Specifically, it's important to create momentum for the change we want to see within the vision and strategy that we've identified. And to celebrate those, to share those, and communicate those widely, because if we can't do that, we're going to lose people. And we need, in small towns with the limited resources and social capital we have, we need to access all of it. And we need to activate that social capital to bring in and build new partnerships outside communities so that we can sustain that momentum and over time build a new sustainability within those communities. So those are my ideas today, and looking forward to questions and talking with you all about your reactions.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was fantastic. And I do want to give people a chance to ask questions, so we'll just try and do, we've got a couple in the chat box. So let's just do this first one here. And it says, in your research, have you seen differences in the types of state interventions and approaches to supporting communities in the midst of a rupture, or models that you would point to from different states?
Yeah, great question. It's one of the reasons we wanted to look at 3 different states with these 3 case studies, because New Mexico, Wyoming, Colorado are quite different beasts. I mentioned this, but I want to highlight how constructive the response in Colorado was. There's a governor's office, I'm going to blank on the name right now, that focuses specifically on dealing with a set of economic issues and transition issues. There's a new Just Transition office in Colorado that the new governor has created that's just really finding its feet right now. But it was a combination of resources from the U.S. Department of Commerce's Economic Development Administration, the governor's office, and DOLA, the Department of Local Affairs, which has more resources than most state offices have for assisting local government with a range of issues, but including economic transition challenges. That team outside the communities in Delta County met the leadership from within Delta County and constructively figured out how to get them the resources they need, ensured they had the facilitation for the difficult discussions about what next and how to bring people into the conversation. And I would say is a model effort for how to do that work. I want to contrast that with Wyoming, which has, and I'm not beating up on Wyoming in any way, shape, or form, Wyoming has tough challenges around whether it's comfortable with this idea of diversifying beyond energy, because it has, as a state, the most narrowly focused economy on energy production of any state in the nation. And its fiscal regime is entirely conditioned on the extraction of energy. So it's a deeply threatening proposition to invest in diversification. And yet, when you have a place like Campbell County and Gillette that is going to live and die on whether they get a diversification strategy right, they need support from the state. So the state has resources, particularly I would highlight the Wyoming Business Council efforts, but those resources are, to say this in a well-meaning way, they're muted efforts to really engage with this question of diversification, because the state is not yet, I think, fully comfortable with this idea. Gillette is, and knows it has to be, because it understands the consequences as existential. And so the state response, in my view, has not been adequate to the needs in Gillette. And in fact, when the folks from Campbell County brought their legislative agenda to Cheyenne this last year, and they met with some success, and we're very grateful for that. They're also frustrated that they're the single largest contributor to state revenue and are not able to tap those revenues and state expertise to invest in their diversification concepts. So I would say that would be a less successful effort right now.
Thank you so much, Ben. We have, for those who still have questions or comments, we just direct you to send those straight to Ben, who generously provided his contact information here. And we're going to go ahead and get ready for the next panel. But first, Kevin wanted to mention.
Yeah, Ben, I really appreciated you mentioning the Delta Montrose Electric Association and the fiber project that they've been funding and really instrumental in. On Monday, WGA is going to be hosting a webinar on how telephone and electric cooperatives in the West have launched broadband networks, and one of our speakers will be from Delta Montrose Electric Association. So if you'd like to learn more about that project, please go to WGA's website and register, and I believe that's at noon on Monday, this coming Monday.